At my sister's wedding, she waved me to the cheap seats and said, "You don't belong here." So I waited until the speeches, stood up, took the microphone, and announced that every vendor had been paid by me and that their refunds were already processing. I, 32M, stood at the entrance of the grand ballroom, watching crystal chandeliers cast fractured light across marble floors. The venue cost more than most people's cars. My sister had chosen well. She always did when spending other people's money. An usher approached, clipboard in hand, and asked for my name. I told him. He scanned his list twice, confusion creasing his forehead, then pointed toward the back corner where folding chairs had been set up near the kitchen doors. The cheap seats, the overflow section, where they put people they invited out of obligation. I made my way through the room, passing tables draped in silk, centerpieces bursting with orchids and roses. Each table had a small card with names written in gold calligraphy. I saw cousins I barely knew sitting near the front. College friends my sister hadn't spoken to in years placed at prime tables. My parents sat at the head table, of course, right next to the bride and groom. The folding chair wobbled when I sat down. The woman next to me, someone's elderly aunt, gave me a sympathetic smile. She understood. We were the afterthoughts. My sister appeared then, a vision in white lace and tulle, making her rounds before the ceremony. She glided from table to table, laughing and hugging guests, her happiness infectious to everyone but me. When she reached my corner, her smile flickered. She leaned down, her perfume overwhelming, and waved her hand dismissively toward where I sat. She told me I didn't belong there, that these seats were for the important guests, and maybe I should wait outside until the ceremony started. Her voice was sweet honey over razor wire. I asked her if she was sure about that. She laughed, that tinkling sound she'd perfected over years of getting exactly what she wanted, and said she was absolutely certain. Then she floated away, leaving me with the folding chair and the kitchen door view. The thing about being the family disappointment is that people stop seeing you as a person. I'd made my choices. Joined the military right out of high school instead of going to college. Deployed twice. Came back different, quieter. Started a small business doing security consulting instead of taking the corporate job my father had lined up. Lived in a modest apartment instead of buying a house in the suburbs. Drove a 10-year-old truck. Wore jeans to family dinners. My sister, meanwhile, had done everything right. Prestigious university. Law degree. Partnership at a firm before 30. Engagement to a man whose family owned half the commercial real estate downtown. She was the golden child, the success story, the one my parents bragged about at their country club. What they didn't know, what nobody knew, was that 6 months ago she'd come to me crying. Her dream wedding was falling apart. The venue she wanted, this very ballroom, had been booked. The caterer she'd been planning around for years was unavailable. The photographer she'd been following on social media was working another wedding. Everything was going wrong. She'd sat in my apartment, mascara running, and begged for help. She knew I had connections. Military buddies who'd gone into event planning, security, hospitality. She knew I could pull strings that her money and status couldn't reach. And she knew I had money. Not flashy money. Not the kind you show off. But the kind you earn by living below your means for a decade and making smart investments with combat pay. So I'd made calls. A venue manager owed me a favor from when I'd consulted on their security system. The booking mysteriously became available. A caterer whose son I'd served with suddenly had an opening. A photographer whose brother I'd helped start a business found room in his schedule. Florist, band, decorator, bartender. One by one, I'd assembled her perfect wedding. And I'd paid for it. Not because she'd asked. She'd assumed our parents were covering it, probably. I'd simply handled the invoices as they came, routing them through my business accounts, keeping everything quiet. The total had been staggering. More than I'd spent on anything in my life. But she was my sister. Blood mattered. Or so I'd thought. The ceremony began. I watched from my folding chair as she walked down the aisle on our father's arm. Watched as she promised forever to a man who'd barely acknowledged my existence in 3 years of family gatherings. Watched as our mother dabbed tears from her eyes and our father beamed with pride. The reception started with cocktails. I stayed in my corner, nursing a beer, watching the beautiful people network and laugh. Dinner came next, served by waiters who gave our section noticeably less attention than the silk table guests. The meal was exquisite. Filet mignon, lobster tail, truffle risotto. I'd approved the menu myself when working with the caterer. Then the speeches began. Best man first, full of college stories and inside jokes. Maid of honor next, tearful and loving. My father stood, speaking about his little girl and how proud he was. My mother followed, welcoming the groom to the family. Everyone laughed and cried at the appropriate moments. I felt the phone in my pocket vibrate. Right on schedule. I'd sent the emails an hour before the ceremony, time to allow for processing. Confirmations were coming through. I stood up. The chair scraped against the floor. A few people near me glanced over, surprised that anyone from the cheap seats would dare interrupt the program. I walked toward the front of the room, my footsteps loud in the momentary silence between speeches. My sister saw me coming. Her eyes widened, then narrowed. She whispered something to the groom, probably telling him to have security remove me. But I'd hired the security. They knew who signed their checks. I reached the microphone. The best man, still holding it, looked confused. I held out my hand. He gave it to me. Years of military bearing meant I knew how to command a room without saying a word. I looked out at the 200 guests. Designer dresses, tailored tuxedos, faces flushed with expensive wine. I looked at my sister, her expression shifting from confusion to concern. I looked at my parents, my father half risen from his chair. Then I spoke. I told them all to enjoy the rest of their evening, that the venue, the food, the flowers, the music, every element of this beautiful celebration had been arranged and paid for by me. I told them about the phone calls, the favors called in, the invoices settled. I told them how my sister had come to me desperate, how I'd moved mountains to give her the perfect day. The room was silent. My sister's face had gone white under her makeup. Then I told them about the emails I'd sent an hour ago. Cancellation requests to every vendor with contracts that allowed for refunds. The venue had a 72-hour cancellation policy with 50% return. The caterer operated under similar terms. The photographer's contract had a cancellation clause. The florist, the band, the decorator. All carefully researched. All legally cancelable. I told them the refunds were already processing. The money was coming back to me. Not to my parents, who everyone assumed had paid. To me. Because I had paid. Every single dollar. My sister found her voice then, asking what I was doing, why I was ruining her wedding. Her voice cracked on the last word. I reminded her about the folding chair. About being told I didn't belong. About 3 years of being treated like an embarrassment, a failure, a charity case at family events. I reminded her about the nephew I had, her son, whose birthday parties I wasn't invited to because she was worried I'd show up in my truck and embarrass her in front of her friends. I reminded her about Thanksgiving when she'd suggested I eat in the kitchen because her husband's boss was coming and she needed to make the right impression. I told her she was right. I didn't belong here. Not in the cheap seats, not in the expensive ones. I didn't belong in a family that measured worth by tax brackets and job titles. Then I set the microphone down and walked out. My phone started ringing before I reached the parking lot. My mother, my father, my sister, all calling simultaneously. I silenced it and drove home. Update 1. The messages started flooding in around midnight. My phone buzzed continuously for hours. Most I deleted without reading. A few I couldn't help but scan. My mother told me I'd humiliated the family, that I was selfish and cruel, that I'd ruined the most important day of my sister's life over hurt feelings. My father's message was shorter, just telling me not to contact them again until I was ready to apologize and make things right financially. My sister's messages oscillated between rage and desperation. First telling me I was dead to her, that she'd never forgive me, that I was a psychopath. Then begging me to reverse the cancellations, promising we could talk, saying she'd been stressed and didn't mean what she'd said about the seating. Then back to anger, threatening legal action, claiming I'd entered into contracts fraudulently. I slept surprisingly well. Years of military service taught me to sleep anywhere, anytime, regardless of stress. The next morning brought unexpected messages. Cousins I hadn't heard from in years, saying they respected what I'd done. An uncle admitting he'd always thought my sister was spoiled. A college friend of mine who'd been at the wedding, sitting at a middle-tier table, saying the whole thing had been uncomfortable to watch even before my speech. The elderly aunt who'd sat next to me in the cheap seats sent a Facebook friend request along with a message saying she'd been treated similarly at family events for years and wished she had the courage to stand up like I had. But the most surprising message came from the groom's younger brother. He told me his brother, my sister's new husband, had been complaining for months about her demanding nature and bridezilla behavior. He said the family was having serious doubts about the marriage, but felt trapped by momentum and social expectations. He thanked me for exposing what kind of person she really was. My sister's best friend, the maid of honor, sent a long message. She told me my sister had been panicking all morning, calling vendors, discovering that yes, the cancellations were real and refunds were processing. The wedding was technically over, but the implications were spreading. Questions about who really paid. Embarrassment in front of 200 witnesses. Her husband's family asking pointed questions about her character. I didn't respond to any of them. There was nothing left to say. Update 2. 3 days later, my father showed up at my apartment. I almost didn't open the door, but curiosity won out. He looked older than I remembered. Tired. He asked if he could come in. I stepped aside. We sat in my living room, the silence stretching between us. Finally, he asked why I'd done it. Not angry, just confused. He genuinely didn't understand. I told him about the folding chair. He waved it off, saying weddings have complicated seating charts, that it wasn't personal. I told him about the birthday parties I wasn't invited to. He said my sister had the right to choose her guest lists. I told him about Thanksgiving and the kitchen. He said I was being too sensitive. Then I asked him if he knew how much the wedding cost. He quoted a figure about 40% lower than what I'd actually paid. I showed him the invoices on my laptop. Showed him the contracts, the payments, the email trails. Watched his face change as he realized his golden child had lied about the costs and let everyone believe he'd paid for everything. He asked why I'd paid if nobody asked me to. I told him she had asked, she'd begged. I told him about her sitting in my apartment crying 6 months ago. His jaw tightened. She'd told him and my mother she'd handled everything herself, that she'd used her savings and her husband's family contribution. I asked him if he'd ever wondered why I stayed distant. Why I skipped holidays, avoided family gatherings, kept conversations brief. He said he'd assumed I was busy with work, with my life. I told him I was avoiding the constant reminder that nothing I did would ever be good enough. He tried to argue, listed my accomplishments. Military service, successful business, financial stability. But his tone was hollow. We both knew those things didn't matter to him. They weren't the right kind of success. Not law degrees and partnerships and country club memberships. I told him about the security contracts I'd landed with major corporations. About the consulting work I did for government agencies. About the investment portfolio I'd built. Numbers that would have impressed him if they'd come from my sister. He listened, but I could see it didn't change anything fundamental. He asked what I wanted. Apology, money, reconciliation. I told him I didn't know anymore. I'd spent so long being the disappointment that I'd built my identity around it. Taking that away felt disorienting. He left after an hour. Said he'd talk to my mother and sister. Said they'd figure something out. I didn't believe him. Update 3. 2 weeks after the wedding, I got a call from my sister's husband. He asked to meet. Against my better judgment, I agreed to coffee. He looked uncomfortable, kept adjusting his tie even though he was in casual clothes. He told me the marriage was already struggling. The wedding revelation had exposed cracks that were probably always there. His family was pressuring him to get an annulment. Her behavior since the wedding, the lying about the costs, the way she'd treated me, it had all painted a picture he didn't like. But that wasn't why he'd asked to meet. He wanted to tell me something he'd overheard the week before the wedding. My sister talking to our mother in the bridal suite, complaining that I'd probably show up in jeans and ruin her aesthetic. Our mother had suggested seating me in the back, out of sight of the photographer's main angles. They'd laughed about it, planned it specifically to keep me from being visible in wedding photos. The folding chairs, the dismissive wave, the comment about not belonging. It hadn't been spontaneous stress. It had been calculated cruelty. He apologized for not saying anything at the time. He'd been too focused on wedding jitters and his own family drama. But he wanted me to know that what I'd done, while shocking, made sense to him now. He said he'd probably have done something similar if his family had treated him that way. I asked him what he was going to do about the marriage. He said he didn't know. Annulment felt extreme, but staying felt like surrender. He was going to counseling, trying to figure out if the person he'd married was who he thought she was or who she'd revealed herself to be. We parted on decent terms. I didn't expect to hear from him again, but it was good to know not everyone in the family thought I was insane. Update 4. A month later, my mother requested a meeting. Neutral territory. A park bench near where we used to live when I was a kid. She looked fragile in a way I'd never seen. Always before she'd been put together, perfect hair and makeup, coordinated outfits. Now she wore jeans and a sweater, and her hair was pulled back simply. She told me she owed me an apology. Said it had taken weeks of arguing with my father and sister to make her see how badly they'd treated me. She'd always dismissed my feelings as oversensitivity, as me being too proud to accept my place in the family. But seeing the wedding invoices, hearing the full story from my father, learning about the calculated seating arrangement, it had forced her to confront uncomfortable truths. She admitted she'd favored my sister. Said it was easier to be proud of someone whose success looked like what she'd been taught success should look like. My path had confused her, scared her even. The military, the danger, the different way of living. She hadn't known how to reconcile the son she'd raised with the man I'd become. I told her I appreciated the apology, but I wasn't sure what came next. Years of distance couldn't be erased by one conversation. She understood. Said she just wanted me to know that she saw me now. Really saw me. And she was sorry it had taken something so dramatic to open her eyes. She asked if I consider coming to Christmas. No pressure, no expectations. Just an invitation. I told her I'd think about it. Final update. 3 months after the wedding, I'm writing this sitting in my apartment, thinking about family and worth and what we owe each other. My sister's marriage lasted 6 weeks. The annulment went through quickly. Turns out when you expose someone's character that completely in front of 200 witnesses, there's not much foundation left to build on. She moved back in with my parents. I heard through the cousin grapevine that she's taking time off work, seeing a therapist, trying to figure out who she is outside of achievements and appearances. My father sent me a check for the wedding costs. I didn't cash it. Sent it back with a note saying the money wasn't the point. It never had been. He called me after receiving it. We talked for 3 hours. Really talked, maybe for the first time in a decade. It didn't fix everything, but it was a start. I went to Christmas. It was awkward at first. My sister and I barely spoke, just acknowledged each other with nods. But toward the end of the night, after everyone else had gone to bed, she found me on the back porch. She asked if I hated her. I told her honestly that I didn't. I was angry, hurt, disappointed. But hate was too strong. She was still my sister, even if I didn't like her very much right now. She told me she was sorry. Really sorry. Not just sorry she got caught or sorry for the consequences. Sorry for years of making me feel small so she could feel bigger. Sorry for measuring my worth by standards that had nothing to do with who I actually was. Sorry for the folding chair and everything it represented. I asked her why she'd done it. She said she didn't have a good answer. Insecurity, mostly. Fear that if she acknowledged my accomplishments, it would diminish hers. Fear that if she let me be seen as successful in my own way, it would reveal how hollow some of her achievements felt. We didn't hug or reconcile dramatically, but we talked. And when I left that night, something had shifted. Not fixed, but shifted. I still live in my modest apartment. Still drive my old truck. Still run my security consulting business. But I'm not the family disappointment anymore. I'm just me. And slowly, painfully, my family is learning that being me is enough. The refunds totaled about 60% of what I'd paid. The rest was lost to non-refundable deposits and processing fees. Worth every penny. Not for the revenge, though I won't lie and say that didn't feel good in the moment, but for the clarity it brought. For forcing everyone to see what had been invisible for too long. Sometimes you have to blow up the foundation to see what's really holding up the house. Turns out in my family's case, not much. But we're rebuilding. Slowly. With better materials this time. And if anyone ever tries to wave me toward the cheap seats again, they'll remember what happened last time. I don't belong there. But then again, I don't belong anywhere I'm not valued. Took me 32 years and one nuclear option to figure that out. If you'd like to see more stories like this, a gentle tap on the subscribe button would mean the world to us.